Hello, welcome to the Robots and Pencils Academy. I'm your host, Jonathan Rasmussen. Today we're going to take a look at how to create UI table views using nibs. Last episode we did it using storyboards, but nibs are important because they're really popular. A lot of applications get built with nibs, and storyboards do a lot of magical things for us automatically. So to really understand what's going on when we create these things, it's really good to be familiar with nibs. So that's what we're going to do in this episode. So let's begin by creating a new Xcode project. And it's going to be a single view application. This time though, make sure Use Storyboards is not selected. We're going to create this one without storyboards. I'm just going to call this project nibs, and go ahead and feel free to save that wherever you like on your desktop. And I'm just going to go to full screen here. Now the first thing you'll notice is we don't have a storyboard file over here. We have this thing called the nib file. And this nib file is basically the view from our model view controller. It's where we're going to create our table view and do some stuff, and every nib is backed by a corresponding controller, and this is the view controller setup for this nib. This is what we get when we create a new Xcode project. Now because I want you to see some of the magic that goes into creating these things, we're going to delete these files that were given to us, and we're going to create a new one from scratch. And the first way we're going to do that is we're going to start by creating a new view or a nib, which we can create by going Command N. And this is a little bit different. We're going to click on User Interface here and click on this thing called View. This is going to be our nib. It's going to be for the iPhone. I'm going to give it a name like Foo View. This is going to be our nib. I'm just going to create it there. And what this will give us is a blank view or canvas to work off of. Now this nib by itself doesn't do anything. We need a view controller to back it up. So I'm going to hit Command N. And we're going to create a new class, but this time we're going to go back to our Cocoa Touch selection up here. Make sure we have Objective-C class selected. And I'm going to give this the name Foo View Controller, and I'm going to make sure its subclass is UI View Controller. So this is going to be the controller, which we're going to tie to this nib. Now if we wanted to create this all at once, a nib with a backing controller, we could do that by selecting with nib for user interface here. But I'm just going to show you a few things that go into making this work manually, just so you get the full picture. And I'm going to go ahead and save that as part of my project. And voila, I've got a view controller now, which I need to connect to this nib. So the way we do that is we go to this thing over here called Files Owner, and we come up to the top, and you see where it says NS Object here? What we're saying for this nib is we want the owner of this nib to actually be backed by a view controller, specifically this Foo View controller, the one we just created. This now makes this view controller sort of the parent or the owner of this nib. Now the other thing we need to do is we need to tie the Files Owner view outlet to this nib. So if we click on Files Owner, and we come over here to these, see these outlets on the right hand side here? You'll see a view property here. We need to drag this over to the view of the nib here. And that basically says, hey, this view is an outlet for that file owner. So those two steps, making sure that we've got the class assigned here and the view outlet drawn here to this view white box over here, make the view controller basically be hooked up to this nib view. Okay, with that, we're now ready to dress this up a bit. So what we're going to do is let's start by adding our table first. I'm going to come down here and type table and go into our little view box here, and I'm going to just drag out a simple table view. And instead of filling up the complete screen, I'm just going to show you what it would look like if you ever created a view and you wanted the table, say, just on the lower half of the screen. So we'll put that there. And the other thing we've got is, let's add an image to this. I've got an image over here, a nice Montreal Canadian emblem. I'm going to drag this over to my project and just make sure that I'm copying the item over. And once I do that, that image is going to be available for me to use over here in our media library. Sometimes I just have to refresh it. Oh, I got to get rid of this table bit here. If I do that, I'll see this Montreal Canadian image that I can just drag over to my view, and I'm just going to plop it in here. There it is, and I think I'll bump it up a bit just to give it some space. And now I just want to put it behind the table. So I'm going to click this document outline here. And by selecting that and then dragging this image just up above the table view, I can put it just behind. And then I can dismiss the document outline. And there, visually we're ready to go. Now before we can run this to see what this looks like, there's one more thing I've got to introduce you to, and that's something called the app delegate. The app delegate is what governs the life cycle of our project. So when we launch an iOS application, we have various callbacks. Like we'll get notified when the application finished launching with options, or when the application is going to go into the background. Because our app delegate was created with a default view controller when it started up, we've got to change this to use our view controller and our nib, the ones we just created. So down here where it says init with nib name, we want this to actually be our foo view nib. So I'm going to change view controller to foo view. Also, we're not going to return a view controller. This was the class called view controller that we got by default. Ours is now called foo view controller. So I'm just going to make a few changes here to make sure we're using the right foo view controller. And then I'm going to go up into the header file up here and make one more change. Instead of returning a view controller here, I'm going to make this a generic UI view controller. And with that, let's go back and just check this .m file. I think we are ready to go. So if we hit run now, let's see what happens. And perfect, there's our view, ready to go. So now we're ready to actually get this table view, to hook the table view up. And that's going to involve 3 steps. First of all, we need to tell our view controller what this table view is. We need to connect them somehow. So we're going to create a property for that. Secondly, we're going to make our view controller over here, this class, actually act as a delegate and data source for the table. So we need to connect that part up also. Then finally, we're going to have to give it some data. And with all that, we should be able to get some data into here and see a table render in a nib. So I'm just going to bring up the assistant editor here, and I'm going to make a little space over here. And let's start with the property. Let's take this table view over here and control drag it over to our foo view controller.h file. And let's give this a property name of table view. Go ahead and connect that. Now let's go back over to our .m file and we'll just check the synthesize. It'll be nice when we don't have to do this anymore, but for now, we will just finish the synthesize by giving it a nice underscore instance variable. Good, so that's the property. This view controller knows about that table. Now we need to say, hey, basically we can support giving you data for that table. So to do that, we need to implement one data source and one delegate here. The first one is UI table view data source, and the second one is the UI table view delegate, just like that. Now for this demo, technically we only need to act as the data source. We're not going to check any callbacks or anything that would come from this UI table view delegate. Everything in here is optional. But if we did want to get any callbacks, for instance, if we wanted to know when someone tapped a row in our table, we would need to implement this. And we would also need to set ourselves up as the table view delegate by basically taking our table view and basically taking the delegate within there and setting that equal to ourselves. So what we're basically saying here is this table view property we just created, it has a delegate, or it's looking to tell someone something happens to this table, and we're saying, hey, you can tell us. We're going to register ourselves as the delegate for that table. So if we wanted any callbacks, this is how we'd hook them up. Again, we don't technically need this for this demo, but I just wanted you to see how this was done. This is a very important line. And I'm just doing it here in the view did load. Okay, now before we hook up the tables with our implementing data source methods, let's just quickly give this guy a property for our data. So just like we did before in the storyboard, I'm going to give this guy make this guy have some data in the form of an array. And we will synthesize this guy for now. With the new versions of Xcode, we won't hopefully have to do this soon. But for now, we'll just do this. And of course, we'll set the data in a getter, just like we did in the storyboard episode here. When someone asks for data, if no data exists, if data is equal to nil, we'll create a new array populated with 3 strings here, and then we'll return that data. That's basically the data for our table. Okay, so now we're ready to implement the 2 methods that are necessary for us to act as a data source for our table. And that is these 2 methods here. Let me just give ourselves a little bit more room. So we've got number of rows and sections. That's just telling us how many rows are in our table, and that's going to come from the count of our data, those 3 arrays, those 3 strings we just defined up here. This is the interesting one right here, cell for row at index path. Let's take a look at what's going on in here. So just like before, we're defining a static initializer because table views reuse their UI table view cells for efficiency. That's why iPhones are so fast when scrolling through tables. So if there's 1 in our queue, we're going to dequeue it and use it. But if there isn't 1, in other words, if this is the first time we're hitting this row, we're going to create a new cell, and this is just going to be a regular UI table view cell. And here we're just basically saying the type of style that we're going to use to initialize it, and we're using the cell identifier we created up here so we can grab it later on with this same string. So that's how our pool is going to work. And then we're just taking the data from that row that we're currently on and setting that to be the label on the text of that row. That's all that's really going on in here. So now if we run this, let's see what happens. So we run it and no data. Okay, let's see what happened here. Why aren't we getting any data? Let's go check our file owner and bring out our properties here. So here's just a few things we should check. We've got our file owner set up. We have set up the view. Okay. What if we click on the table itself and we go look at its outlets? Uh-oh. This is what I missed. Apologies, my fault. While we've instantiated a view controller and configured it so it can handle the data, we haven't told the table who its data source and delegate are. That's what these 2 little gray circles here mean. What we need to do is click on these and drag them over to the file's owner. That says that my file owner, or the view controller that we hooked up for this nib, use it to get your data source and your delegate methods for the table view. This is probably the #1 mistake or thing I forget to do when creating these things. So if you go to instantiate your table and it's not rendering, check and make sure you've actually hooked up your data source and delegate. All right, let's hit run now and see what happens. And voila, there we go, data in our table. Well, that's just a quick introduction to nibs and how to set up table views with them. The big difference between storyboards and nibs, and that in storyboards, a lot of these things were taken care of for us. For instance, this data source delegate bit, that was handled automatically for us when we just dragged out that UI table view controller. But I wanted you guys to see how nibs work, because if you're on a project where nibs are in use, you're going to need to understand sort of the mechanics behind these things and how they all work together. So hopefully that was useful. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.